I'd like to talk about lithium-ion cells, their strengths and weaknesses particularly. The issue of sort of balance in a battery. Talk a little bit about kind of classical BMS, because I hear a lot of people saying you must have a BMS, but actually when you ask people, there are not very many who seem to be able to say what it should actually do. I've done a couple of tests. I've done that I thought I'd report on today. I've done a number of tests, but I did one where I took a pack of cells and cycled them as a battery for 2,000 cycles. So I'm just going to respond to that. And more recently, I've been involved doing a fast charge test. So I've taken two relatively small battery packs in parallel and charged and discharged them under identical conditions, except that one was at 120 amps and one was at 20 amps charged, just to see what the difference in life was likely to be. Because one of the things that's been said is that fast charging reduces the lifetime of the battery, and I wanted to see A, whether that was true, and B, whether it the extent of it. Finish off by talking a little bit about cell qualification. That qualification, but I mean choosing if you're going to choosing the cells you're going to use if you have more than one spare available, or if you've got any spare available, deciding which are the best cells to use. So if we start with sort of strengths and weaknesses, apologies, do come in, Kelsey. I think there's the odd bit of room over that side. So.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Is this research just independent? Or?
Yes. That's I'm involved in starting a company with my brother, but at the moment this was just done purely to support my own work on the civic conversion, and also because I don't altogether trust some of the stuff that you see floating around. Even that produced by the manufacturer is not always correct. So a little bit of an apology. There are some of you here who will know some of this stuff like the back of your hand, and other people for whom it will go over the top of your head. So I'm just going to start by talking a little bit about, perhaps for those who are slightly less familiar with lithium-ion batteries. I mean, lithium-ion batteries really are the sort of magic bullet on which the modern electric vehicle movement is founded. Compared with lead acid, which has always been the sort of main alternative, they're far lighter and smaller in volume for a given amount of power. About a factor of roughly 3 compared to the lead acid. The other thing is that they last a great deal longer. If you talk to Mike Schooling downstairs, for example, he ran a lead acid car for a year or so, and it started off at 30 miles range, and after a couple of years it was down to about 3 miles. Lithium-ion cells last very, very much longer if you take care of them. They also have relatively, compared to the lead acid and possibly nickel metal hydride, I don't know, they have relatively little sag. This car is the Mclaren F1, which some people regard as the sort of peak, certainly of 20th century automotive technology. And this is a Tesla Model D, which is purely electric. The Tesla Model D and the McLaren F1 have fairly similar 0 to 60 times. So an electric motor with good batteries can produce a great deal of power. A couple of other things. One is that they have, certainly in my experience, negligible self-discharge. Self-discharge is where if you put a battery on the shelf and come back in 6 months. Tim isn't here, Tim Crumpton is he? No, he had cells that he had sitting around for some considerable time. They don't really self-discharge very much. Do come in. If you want to come over the other side, I think there's a bit more standing room over there. there.
Sorry about that.
So they've got, relatively speaking, negligible self-discharge. I mean, you can still have a problem if you've got a little bit of if you've got the electric clock running off your pack and it's running all the time. People have bricked these packs before by running them down, but they don't really self-discharge. The other thing that was touched on in the last discussion is that they're actually very happy to be partially charged. With lead acid batteries, if you don't from time to time fully charge a lead acid cell, it will sulfate and you'll have problems. Lithium ion actually prefer not to be fully charged, as Mike was saying. The main problem with these batteries is that they are a little on the touchy side. They're entirely intolerant of being overcharged. And some of the lithium-ion, there are several different lithium-ion chemistries. Some lithium-ion chemistries, particularly lithium cobalt, is rather prone to thermal runaway, which means that if you get the battery up to a particular temperature, it starts producing its own oxygen, and there's no point in shoveling sand or whatever on it because it won't snuff out the fire. This was the problem that the 787, Boeing had with the 787. For some odd reason, they'd use lithium cobalt cells, probably because of the timing of the design. I wouldn't use lithium cobalt cells in a lawnmower, let alone an aeroplane. Other disadvantages, they shouldn't be charged below freezing. I mean, it varies a little bit from one cell manufacturer to another, but low temperatures they don't like. If you charge the cells below zero, that's not a good thing to do. That actually means it's a little bit of a problem just to take a... Oh, we have another visitor here, I think. Can you let the gentleman in? Oh, yes. All right. Don't want to encourage him in if he wants to have another coffee. It's a bit difficult to take the ordinary lead acid battery, starter lighting ignition battery, out of a conventional car and replace it with lithium ion, because in cold weather it's going to object slightly. The other reason you can't do that is that, or shouldn't do that, is that lithium ion cells don't like being trickle charged. With your starter lighting ignition battery in your conventional piston engine car, it's just getting a small current all the time just to keep it topped up. That's not the way you should treat lithium ion. You charge them up, and at the end of the charge process, you follow the charge algorithm. At the end of the charge process, you chop it off and disconnect it completely. So I'd like to talk then about the, why hasn't that moved on? About the lithium ion, about the balance problem. That was supposed to move down, but it hasn't. Managing long strings of lead acid, lithium ion cells. There's a little bit of an issue here. There's been a lot of testing of individual cells. People will take a cell and put it in a test machine and test it for a while. One of the things I certainly haven't seen much of, and what I was particularly aiming to do, was to test strings of cells together. And one of the ways of thinking about the way in which several cells together will work in series is to think of them as like a bunch of glasses or jugs that you're going to fill with some sort of liquid. And that's interesting. On my version of PowerPoint, that's the other way up. Use a little bit of, I don't know if this is going to work. I may just end up having to explain it. I mean, broadly speaking, that's if you'd imagine that was supposed to be the other way up. The idea, in an ideal world, even if you've got several different containers, if you want lined up. If you want to get the maximum amount of liquid into them, you would fill them all up. Then if you want to take the liquid out, you would take all the liquid out. And that would be the ideal thing with a battery. In an ideal world, every cell in the battery, when the battery was completely discharged, would be empty. And when the battery was completely charged, every cell would be full. The problem is you can't actually do that because you're putting the same amount of charge. Because the cells are all in series, you're putting the same amount of charge into each of them. It would be as if you were filling your jugs from the same pot, and you were only allowed to put the same amount of fluid in. So you've really got two alternatives. You can either line all the cells up at the bottom so that when all the cells are discharged, they're all at the same level. That's sometimes referred to as bottom balancing, and there's a little bit of it's like walking into Lilliput and shouting big enders forever. You know, there's a little bit of an issue about people have different opinions on this, but I'm going to give you mine and leave it at that. The problem of if you bottom balance a pack is that you've got a ragged top. Then when you charge the battery up, some of the cells will reach maximum before the others do. But on the other hand, they'll all get to the bottom at about the same time. The alternative for you is to line them up at the top, so they're all complete. When the battery is fully charged, they're all at the top. But the problem, of course, that means then is that you've got an imbalance at the bottom. They don't all reach the bottom of discharge together. Do come in.
That's all right.
One of the main reasons I don't like that approach is that it has a habit of destroying cells, because if you discharge the battery and you've got one weak cell and all the other cells keep piling current through it, you can end up with the thing being charged in reverse, and the effect is that you end up destroying the cell. With lead acid, you tend to get, the graphics are not really working on this. You can tend to get a bit of self-discharge. You get, in effect, a leak from the cell. That doesn't actually happen with certainly in my observation of lithium iron phosphate cells. I've not managed to observe anything that I would call any significant self-discharge. I've had cells sitting there for a couple of years, and they're still just the same as when they were parked. Lead acid cells need a full charge sometimes. As I mentioned, they'll sulfate, and if you don't fully charge them, it'll damage the cells. Again, that's not a problem with lithium iron phosphate. So this, I think, it must be a different version of PowerPoint. They got all this very carefully set up, and it hasn't worked. The sort of classical BMS, classical battery management system, lines up at the top. That, if you think about it, that's by far the easiest way of doing it, because if you're fully charging the battery every night, then that's the one time in the day when you know you're at a fixed point. The problem with that is that you end up with effectively a device for each cell, which will either bleed off a little bit of extra charge, or it'll shuffle charge from one cell to another, or it'll put a little bit of extra charge into the lower cells. So you end up with a little bit of apparatus like that. The other thing that the classical battery management system has to handle is the fact that you're unbalanced at the bottom. Your battery is exposed to risk, because if you over discharge the battery, it may feel fine, may keep providing power, but there may be some poor cell that's being knackered. So what you need, in effect, again at the individual cell level, is something that will monitor each cell and shout, scream, jump up and down when you get down to the bottom. And the difficulty with this is that it makes for a scale problem. If you've got 100 cells, let's say, in a typical battery, then you've got a fair amount of complexity. You've got devices to shuffle charge between, or burn off charge between every single one of the cells. You've got a monitor on each cell, and you also have the issue of if just one of your little bits of electronics goes bad, you potentially have a problem. And this does, in the real world, make for considerable complexity. This is the battery management system out of a Renault Fluenza. And you can see we've got a great mass of wires here. And this is just part of the cell board, just a small part of the cell board to give you a flavour of the sort of complexity of the electronics and something like that. The other side of the board looks just the same. And the other thing is these just aren't 12-volt wires. They're relatively high voltage, and because they're having to burn off current, they aren't just signal wires either. They're potentially wires that may be carrying a not insignificant current. The other problem is that the way that most battery management systems work is that they attempt to balance. They don't actually balance on charge. They balance on voltage instead. And that may sound like a bit of nitpicking, but it isn't altogether, because there are sort of dynamic effects on the voltage. So the voltage of a cell may be temporarily high or low for reasons other than its state of charge. This is a graph of the charge profile, or the voltage of 8 cells during a charge process. You've got basically here is a regime where there's a constant current flowing through the battery, and the cell voltages are all rising together. As I say, there are 8 cells here. And then at this point, one of the cells, which is otherwise perfectly good, goes through the roof. And there's just a few tens of millivolts difference between the cells all the way up to here. And then at this point, this is the end of charge here. At that point, there's about half a volt difference between the cells. But if you follow this through, can you see what happens here? This portion here is actually a rest. So the charge cycle here, it charged, and then the device controlling the charge just stopped everything, left the thing open circuit. Can you see that all the voltages have converged again? There's no current at all flowing here. This very high voltage has just come right back into line there. So if a battery management system had said, oops, this one's getting overcharged, cut it down somewhere, it would now be way down here somewhere. So a battery management system that attempts to balance cells on voltage under charge, it's heresy to say so, but it's actually conceptually flawed. It's not just a problem of scale. It's actually doing the wrong thing. Let's go on to the 2000 cycle set test. What I did here was I got a bunch of these 40 amp hour, these are 40 amp hour lithium iron phosphate prismatic cells. They're actually manufactured by a Chinese company, CALP, China Aviation Lithium Battery. If you look at Indra's desk downstairs, they've got some of them on. They're the grey cells. So I used some, use some of those. When I started out particularly, I was very unsure of whether I might have pyrotechnics. So I've got a little metal shed and put it in the garden, and that's where I did my battery testing. I've got a little more confidence since. When I left home this morning, there were a couple of rigs working away, one on my dining room table and the other on my desk. Again, I'm afraid it's totally messed up the graphics here, but broadly speaking, what I've got is, if you could imagine, this represents the line of cells. I've just showed them as ordinary cylindrical cells, but actually they were prismatics. And then I've got what amounts to a switch here, a relay. So what happens is that they're all connected to the charger, charged up by the charger, then the relay swaps over and they're discharged with the load, and that just kept happening for a couple of thousand cycles with this particular test. I've done several of them. They did some of the headways as well, if anybody's interested in those. I monitored voltage using a cheap little device. I was paying for all this myself, so this is designed for the radio control model market. If anybody wants to do anything like this, have a word with me, because one of those things will trash your cells if you don't if you don't put a bit of electronics in between, because they bleed off a significant amount of current. And then I used one of these gadgets, which some of you may recognize. It's a thing called an Arduino. It's just, if you like, a tiny microprocessor board. Again, cheap and cheerful. And the whole lot was controlled by a laptop, which wrote files, CSV files. So I've got, if anybody's interested, I've got several tens of millions of data points from various things, collecting data for every 30 seconds for several years. Then I used just very crude dump resistors and off-the-shelf chargers. So what do the results look like? Sorry, what was it about? I really wanted to do two things with this test. One was to just verify that there wasn't actually any cell drift. There have been huge, vicious arguments online about the way in which these cells behave, and I'd seen some data from somebody's car saying basically the cells didn't seem to drift. So I wanted to see whether that was the case. This was actually about the third test run I'd done, and I'd got up to about 600 cycles on a previous test and not seen any drift. And then I wanted to see whether we could get close to the manufacturer's view of what the cycle life should be. In other words, could I get for an entire battery what the manufacturer said ought to be possible for single cell? So that was really what I was sort of aiming to do. So as I say, the pack, I bottom balanced it before I assembled it. So I discharged all the cells down to the same relatively low voltage, then strapped them all up and charged and started the test. I did most cycles. I used about 75% of the cell's capacity. You remember Mike Boxall, those who are here were just saying, these cells actually quite like to be slightly undercharged, under-discharged. So that's what I did for most of the cycles. And then every 50th cycle, I did a sort of maximum effort charge in order to verify how much capacity the thing had left. If you look at, I'll come out just desperately well again on here, but I don't know if you can see it. This is the curve of voltages. There are 8 voltages here, and then this is the charge of current, this line here. So basically what happens is you charge, then you rest, and then you discharge, and it drops off the end, and then that's the beginning, a bit of rest at the end. So that was, I just repeated that, I'd say a couple of thousand times. If you want to sort of break it down into bits, this bit here is constant current charging. So you've got a section here where the current's pretty well standard. This is a fairly standard way of charging lithium-ion cells. Then you've got an area that's constant voltage. So what's happening here is that the battery charger it's not doing a brilliant job. It's a cheap and nasty charger. is attempting to maintain roughly a constant battery voltage, and it's tapering the current off in order to do that. And then here it just stops completely. It gets down to about 5% of the batteries of the original charge rate. So I then had the rest that I referred to as no current flowing at all. And then there's the discharge. And again, the graphics haven't come out very well. This is supposed to be pointing up to here. Can you see that all the cells have really gone over the knee together? This is fairly characteristic of the behavior of lithium-ion cells, certainly lithium-ion phosphate. You get a fairly constant voltage during discharge, and then suddenly they'll drop off the end. Do you guys need to come out? Yes. Oh, I'm very impressed that you managed to listen at all to me rabbiting on about lithium-ion cells. So, I mean, in practical terms, this means that after 1,000 cycles, the cells are still pretty much in balance. They'd all gone over the knee, as it's called, together. So they discharge without too much loss of voltage, and then quite suddenly drop off. That's the same thing again. That's just the discharge part of cycle 1,000. And for comparison, that's the 100th cycle. I don't know what happened here. The difference in voltage is not very great. There may have been some slight resistance or something at that point. And then that's cycle 2,000. And can you see in each case, these are all 8 traces of voltages of 8 cells. They're all going over the knee together, so they're all staying in balance. So to my mind, that was the smoking gun, really. I'd cycled this battery for 2,000 cycles with no battery management system whatever, no balancing since assembly. And after 2,000 cycles, they were still going over the knee together. So that was good enough for me. This is the graph of loss of capacity. What I did every 50 cycles, I took a measurement of the cell capacity and plotted it on here. It waves around a bit because I think it varies with temperature and things like that, and also just experimental error. But you can see that it's not doing too badly. This green horizontal line is about 80% of the original capacity. And you can see that it's crossing over that line somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 cycles.
This was charging up to 75%?
Most of the time.
And then every 50th, 100%?
Exactly that. That's precisely that.
Are you going to test them to failing point?
Sorry?
Are you going to carry on testing them until they fail?
No, I quit at this point. I got bored with doing it. I've got other ones. I'm doing some testing on other chemistries at the moment. So that's keeping me fairly well occupied, and the fast charge test is still running. So just moving on then, fast charge test. This is the test rig for the fast charge tester. As I mentioned, the plan with this was to take 2 identical packs, put them side by side, treat them exactly the same, cycle them in exactly the same way, except that one pack was getting 120 amps, 3C for those of you who use that sort of terminology, and the other was getting 20 amps. Half C, 0.5 C. So what I was trying to do here is just to check the effect of fast charge on cycle life. I'll go a little more quickly here because we're running out of time. So I mentioned this already. We've got 2 parallel packs here, and same sort of approach. Most of the cycles stop a little early. The layout was broadly like this. We had a power supply capable of 160 amps, which a kind friend just gave me because it was not cheap. A dump resistor, which was used for the discharge, and then the 2 packs. So the negatives were permanently connected. Then they had a bank of high current relays that would swap round, just swap the packs over. So it was a little bit of a complicated from a control point of view, at least for somebody like me. This is a similar sort of graph to the previous one. We've got the solid lines are the voltages of the 2 packs, and then the currents are down here, and you see this is the 120 amp peak. It's only for a relatively short time. Little notch here, because what I did at the end of the 120 amps, I just gave it a little shot of an extra 20 amps, so that it was about the same kind of charge level as the other pack. Temperatures during charge. These cells cope very well with high charge rates. The temperature only went up about, even at the 3C, I mean that's fairly whacking current for a smallish cell. Temperature went up less than 20 degrees centigrade. Wasn't for very long, of course. One of the interesting things is I'd originally assembled the cells using dielectric grease to try and keep corrosion out. And I actually found that increased the temperature of the terminals. The wretched things were, it was a nice idea, but not one that worked terribly well. Excuse me. And this is an example of the sort of output that I was getting out of the thing. And this really is where I was aiming to get to. These numbers are slightly confusing. What I did was I took, for each of the 2 packs, they had slightly different capacities anyway. I took the 50th cycle and said, all right, we'll regard that as the baseline, and then plotted the loss of capacity, and you can see that there is a difference between them. The red one is the one that's charged at a low rate of charge, and the bluish one at a high rate of charge. And there's a difference between them, but it's not horrendous. And bearing in mind that this was fast charge in every cycle, so it's it makes it was a pretty severe test from the point of view of the cell. So, we've got a small increase in or reduction in cycle life from fast charging, but it's not horrendous.
Sorry, John, what was that manufacturer you were using these tests on?
These were China Aviation Lithium battery. If you look on the Indra stand downstairs, they're the grey cells. They're the same ones that I used in the Civic.
What's the maximum C rate for those cells?
I think the manufacturer, they changed the figures, but from memory, in practical terms, it's about 10C, so that's discharge. So it's I don't know what it would be charging offhand, but I tend to ignore the manufacturer's figures and just try it. Yeah. And the first lot of charging I was doing, I got all sorts of dire warnings from people supplying the cells that they weren't happy because they gave me the charger and the cells. They weren't happy with the current that I specified, but it was okay. It was I think I was charging the cells at about 2C, something like that, and they thought that was not a good idea because the spec sheet said 0.4 or something.
Excuse me, George, before you go on there.
I'm sorry?
Excuse me, just before you go on there, can I ask you a question there? Just on
Sure, yes.
Congratulations on your test. It must have been teeth pulling at times, but you see the 3C one you done?
Yeah.
Did you say you gave it a 20 amp kick at the end?
Yes, I did.
I'm wondering, do you think possibly did that kick at the end, maybe if there's heat and whatnot internally in the battery, had any degradation on the fast charging because it's tapered off slightly compared to the
I wouldn't have expected so. I mean, that's a fair point. be interesting to try it without, but my expectation would be that there wouldn't be any difference, really.
Just wondering if it would cause any sort of physical wobble, as it would be?
I can't immediately think of a mechanism for that, but I mean, if I was being absolutely an absolute purist, I would do as you suggest and try without. But that was mostly because the fast charge inevitably means that you're not putting quite as much, you're not charging the battery up quite as much. So by having that extra little bit of 20 amps at the end meant that it was, in terms of the percentage it was being charged, it was fairly similar to the other one. So that was the reason for doing it. Cell qualification. I'm running a little bit over. I'm about 15 minutes over. We could just leave it at that and take questions. Or if you'd like me to finish this off, it would take about 5 minutes.
Go for it.
Go for it. Okay, right. I got 38 cells for my Civic, which only needs 36, which was fortunate because 2 of them turned out to be duds. If you take a batch of today's cells anyway, certainly the prismatic cells, I think the cylindrical ones are better, but if you take the prismatic cells, you will find the odd one does self-discharge. Most of them don't, but there's the odd one that does. And in my view, it's quite important to identify those cells. People talk about soft shorts, which I think is probably fairly descriptive. The way I understand it is you've got some small contamination in the cell or something, and it causes a very slight internal current leak in the battery. Well, quite apart from messing up the balance, if you got such a thing, then it might possibly one day become not a quiet short. This was actually suggested by a paper written by a guy in NASA. His main concern was that he was sending people off into spacewalks with lithium-ion batteries stuffed up their chuff, and he really didn't want them catching fire. So he was interested in qualifying out any bad cells. What you tend to find with a good cell, can you see that at all? I can hardly see it. Sorry, the graphics are completely hopeless. I better describe it. What happens is what happened here was that I completely discharged the cell. Did it one cell at a time, discharged the cell completely, and then let them sit for a week. With some voltage monitoring connected up to them, and check the voltage. What you see, or what you could see if this thing had put it up on the screen, is that the voltage recovers and then continues to recover more slowly. And actually, they didn't completely stabilize till about 3 or 4 days out. And certainly, some of the testing that I'm doing on other cell chemistries at the moment, using the smaller cylindrical cells, I'm seeing recoveries that sometimes take place over a week. You know, the battery's been sitting there for a week with no current running through it, and the voltage is just slowly going up.
After full discharge?
Sorry?
After a full discharge? After
a full discharge, yes. I mean, in one lot of cells I've been testing recently, it went up 1/4 of a volt. I had them sitting there, held down. Come in. This one, just to finish off on this, with bad cells, exactly the same thing. Leave it sit for a week, discharge it, and if it drops in voltage, it's bad. I had 2 bad ones like that out of 38. Okay, let's go, shall we?